good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Thanks for being here in this webinar, part of the WorldFAIR webinar series presenting project outputs. And this is the second webinar of the case studies on social surveys and cultural heritage, presenting their published reports. Some housekeeping before we begin. This webinar is being recorded. The recording will be shared on our YouTube channel, on our website, and via email to the registered attendees. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat during the presentations. There will be a Q&A section at the very end. So we have reached the end of the first round of our webinar series. It started in May this year, and we actually the two case studies kickstarted this webinar series, and now we are ending the first round with it. Nice full circle. And the new dates for 2024 are currently being scheduled and will be published soon on our website, which you can see in my screen there, the tiny URL, and I will also put it in the chat after this presentation. So keep checking. We publish all recordings and resources from our webinars, and all the future dates will also be there soon. So today, first up, we will hear from our case study on social surveys, which undertakes a comparative study of data management, harmonization, and integration practices leveraging the DDI metadata standards to understand how multinational collections can be made increasingly interoperable and reusable through shared procedural and technical development, and works on establishing a set of guidelines and tools for the development of cross-national collections. The case study will present today their second published report, Cross-National Social Sciences Survey Best Practice Guidelines, which outlines a proposed workflow for the processing of data harmonization of social surveys that takes account of the practical steps required to bring diverse content together in a machine-actionable way. Our speaker is Steve McEachern, the director of the Australian Data Archive and co-data officer. And after Steve's presentation, we will hear from our case study on cultural heritage, which works on producing a mapping report of existing policies and practices that support image sharing across diverse collecting institutions, and develops a set of broadly applicable recommendations for shifting these practices into closer alignment with FAIR. And finally works on implementing these recommendations at the Digital Repository of Ireland, which is where the work package team is, the work package lead is based. So establishing fair practices in the GLAM sector has a very significant effect on the sharing of cultural heritage data and on the research data management practices across the arts, humanities, and social science disciplines, making this case study multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral. Today, the team will talk about the Cultural Heritage Image Sharing Recommendations Report, their second published deliverable, which builds on their understanding of what it means to support FAIR and the sharing of image data derived from GLAM collections. The report looks at previous efforts by the sector towards FAIR alignment and presents 5 recommendations designed to be implemented and tested at the DRI. Our speaker today is Beth Kizuk, Project Manager for Research Data at the Digital Repository of Ireland. And remember to post any questions for our two presenters during their presentations, and we will have a Q&A section at the very end. Thank you, and now on to Stephen.
Thanks, Alex. And thank you all for joining us this morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. Let me just bring up our share screen here, and we will get up and running. Okay, just displays there. Okay, so I think we've got the right screen coming. Alex, is that right?
Yes,
just
great.
Confirming. Yep, excellent. So this is, as Alex has pointed out, sort of the second reporting on the second deliverable in the work we've been doing as part of the WorldFAIR project. Before I start talking about some of the specifics, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, seas and waters of the areas that I live and work and meet on, which is the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on the east coast of Australia and the Canberra region. I acknowledge their continuing connection to their culture and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. So, let's say a little bit about who we are and who's involved in this work package in the WorldFAIR program before I get into the details. There are two organisations who are involved from here and in Norway. So I'm at the Australian Data Archive, where we provide national service collection and preservation of digital research data for use by academic research and other users. We're also based in a centre for social research and methods at ANU. So we have a lot of application of the use of research data at ANU as well. Our colleagues in the work package are the equivalent organisation in Norway, SICT, formerly known as the NSD. SICT is the Norwegian Agency for Shared Services, Education and Research, and they acquire and deliver services for education and research, providing infrastructure for education and research, including social science data archiving in Norway. And that's important because what this particular work package was focused on is actually looking at sort of harmonisation of data through harmonisation of technology and practice in related operations in the two organisations. So our organisations are involved in collaborative international social survey projects, including the European Social Survey and the International Social Survey Programme. We both provide data archiving services. We conduct social survey research projects, and we are members of the DDI Alliance and been involved in the development of DDI-CDI, which is sort of a core element of the cross-domain interoperability framework, which is another part of the WorldFAIR program. So, let's say we were able to both look at sort of the shared technology and the shared practices that we might be able to better harmonise to support machine operable data harmonisation in our domain. So what are we doing? As I say, the work package is oriented towards a comparative study of data management, harmonisation, integration practices of one of the satellite countries in the European Social Survey, Australia, where we conducted a parallel study to the European Social Survey back in 2020, and then the core European Social Survey, which is a European social science infrastructure funded through the Horizon and other programs. So we're examining administrative procedures, data and metadata management, and technical environments for the development and management of this data. The second deliverable, and this is the focus of this presentation, is trying to leverage DDI metadata standards to understand how such collections could be made increasingly interoperable and reusable through shared procedural and technical development. And that's really the focus of today, is looking really down in the weeds at the capabilities and the content that exists and the sorts of things we need to do in practice and in technology to establish a set of guidelines and tools for cross-national collections into the future. So it really tries to go right down into the services we provide and the sorts of data and metadata that exists within the collections that we're working with and what's required here. Sorry, I've got to end up with a duplication of the slide here. So I say the emphasis here is on what we term data harmonisation, and the social sciences, cross-national and comparative social surveys are a long time analytic tool of the social science researchers. We're often interested in comparing national and international and cross-national outcomes in terms of things like cultural institutions or social institutions, persistent attitudes and practices between countries and how they might relate to the sorts of institutions that emerge within those countries and vice versa. So do we see certain types of attitudes and practices prevalent that are associated with those institutions at the same time? So comparative survey data has been an important tool in the package of what's available to social science researchers. The sorts of methodologies that are being used, there is a long history of doing this work. So there's a framework that's been developed, often oriented around these large cross-national programs. Identifies three basic types. So you get essentially you can design it in advance. So what we call input, translation, and adaptation. So in this particular context, an organization, a coordinating organization, will develop a survey instrument and commission or coordinate a set of countries to use the same survey methodology and the same survey questionnaire and same types of sampling and data collection practices to collect the data. So we're designing a lot of the harmonisation in advance. The questions and the things are being collected by design using the same process. A variation on that, what's known as ex-ante output harmonisation, is that you might have variations in the way you go about collecting data, but they're pre-designed recoding of data to the same outcome standards as well. So we line up the outputs that will come out of the data sets that we produce from a survey in advance. And the International Social Survey Program is an example of this. In the European Social Survey is an example of the input harmonisation methodology. The third type is what's called ex post output harmonisation. So where data wasn't designed to be matched in advance, but we're trying to find secondary data that already exists and build an integrated database using a common definition, but often having to deal with quite a lot of variation in the content that's coming in, because it wasn't intended at the time of collection to be to be harmonised with other content. So there's been, I say, the sorts of standards that exist for supporting this. The metadata standard that's used a lot in the social sciences. For official statistics, you have a lot of this sort of comparative integration. The statistical data and metadata exchange is the most commonly used standard for supporting integration of particularly aggregate data. Things like the World Bank, the International Monetary Foundation, and a lot of the international institutions, the UN Statistical Division, for example, use this for moving and comparing data between countries. At the level of surveys, the more common standard used is a standard called the Data Documentation Initiative that's come out of actually the Social Science Archives and has been used to provide a means for exchanging metadata around questions, variables, and data sets in surveys. And so they've actually developed a framework in some of the more recent versions of this standard, oriented around a three-level way of thinking about how you can describe the relationships between different types of content. We can start from the top or the bottom here. I'll start from the bottom. We have here we talk about variables. So variables are essentially the columns of data in data sets actually used within a data set itself. At the top is the thing we're trying to achieve, the conceptual variable. So essentially we have an idea of a concept we're trying to measure. It might be marital status in this particular case, and we're trying, but we might say marital status is married or divorced, separated, or never married, but we haven't assigned codes to that. So we'll often assign M or a D for divorced, or it might be a 1 or a 2, etc. The one in the middle here, the represented variable, is that representation with those codes involved. So what we have to do is translate the information that's in the instance variable in the data sets we have to this common conceptual standard by harmonizing the representations in the middle here to the codes and categories that exist. That lines up pretty well with the sorts of survey data elements that actually exists in our survey. So we have DDI also matches this information to the content we see collected in standard data formats. Some of the more common ones in the social sciences, there aren't that many statistical packages actually used. So we have things like SPSS or Stata, R is another software package used. They all tend to represent information in pretty consistent ways. And so they do map fairly well the information that's there. Those categories and codes, we often have what's called a data dictionary. We might use units of measure, kilograms, meters, etc. And we might also have a representation of information on the properties of the data. The one more challenging one, and this is where we often have challenges in sort of managing this procedure, is actually in the encoding of the values in the data set itself. That can include character encodings, the data types. Is it numeric? Is it text? Is it is it character or numeric? What sorts of code sets do they use? Are they using encoding of Japanese characters or accents and things like that? So these sorts of things can play around with our sort of the processing as well. So what we've been trying to work towards is looking at saying this is the output of deliverable 6.2, is really trying to document a designer workflow that will allow us to sort of streamline this harmonization process. Now, to say there's nothing particularly revealing here. It's a fairly standardized process and fairly obvious process to be trying to follow if you're interested in doing this type of work. The key to it, though, is if we can proceduralize this. What we've tended to do, and this is the output of our first deliverable 6.1, is we found the process is administratively very similar, but the way it gets implemented in the technologies and data that we use varies, in enough small ways to make it very difficult to automate or even semi-automate in the work that we do. So what we were trying to do here was actually, really dig into the details to say, well, how would we design a workflow or a set of workflows, in fact, that actually might allow us to do, much more machine operable implementation of such a workflow. We based this on some recent work that was being done, particularly in Europe and most particularly in Poland at the Polish Academy of Sciences. So this is a description of some work by Kolzinska, who's been involved in what's a program in the Polish Academy of Sciences called survey data recycling, and then implemented in a package they've been developing with colleagues in different parts of Europe called RetroHarmonize, which is an R package for harmonizing survey data in post hoc methods that I touched on before. And we've picked up that workflow as really being a good way of actually representing the sorts of procedures that we need to use. And what we've tried to align with that is the sorts of machine operations, or currently that are human operations, that we'll need to do this harmonization progressively. And the idea being is if we can identify the business, the workflows that are needed, and then progressively automate those workflows, we can hopefully speed up the data management and the data into harmonization process in significant ways. So the publication itself, the deliverable itself, kind of works through what those procedures might be, and nicely, a number of these have been implemented in different ways in existing software. Now, there'll still be some work to do, but what we can start to see is a set of procedures that we can probably implement in different code bases. At ADA, we're using R increasingly, along with SPSS. At SICK, they're using Python. But we should be able to implement, sort of standardized libraries for doing this processing. And trying to find ways that allow us to essentially reproduce these steps in consistent ways, and hopefully able to point to registries that reflect the sorts of information that we need. So the basic workflow works like this. We've got, data import, is clearly the first step in the process. And that seems like an obvious step, but kind of making the point that if we can automate the data import process, particularly using API based on authentication and access, we have a reproducible starting point. And that's the idea right through the process here, is be able to, what can we reproduce here, what can we systematize so that we can kind of produce code libraries to step through the process much more efficiently. The second stage is really in the harmonization of concepts. So be able, in the way that we had back in that DDI triangular model, defining the concept or concepts of interest essentially into a concept map. So it might be marital status that we define here. Establishing a standard set of target conceptual variables, that's at the top. So what is the terminology that we're using? What is the categories that we need to be able to reflect there? Married, divorced, never married, separated, etc. And then establishing the source variables in the data sets that we have that map most effectively to that standardized conceptual variable. What we'd also like to be able to do is establish in that conceptual variable a sort of a standardized representation. So And we can do this using a variable registry, and SICT have established a variable registry. ADA is in the process of doing so as well. This aligns quite nicely with the input harmonization that we were talking about earlier. If we can make an expected representation, available through a registry, we can hopefully point any tools towards that registry to say, this is what we want the target to look like. The next stage that we're looking at is then in harmonization of the variable name. So this I say, for now, a lot of this work has to happen manually. We have to say, and in particular, what we try to do as a bit of experimentation in this and a related project, they say, can we readily find two variables and two different data sets that essentially measure the same thing? Can we find candidates that seem to be trying to measure the same thing? And that becomes quite difficult because a lot of the encoding that's been done previously before we get to processing, receiving the data itself. So we often get things like terms have been shortened to, it might be mass stat, or it might be the sort of variations in variable names you see on screen here. So it's right now we don't have a really good candidate for being able to discover variables that they're going to be easily harmonized. So that still requires some work on behalf of the researcher. Nicely though, in a lot of cases, we do do tend to reuse quite a lot of the questions in surveys and things like that we can use as sort of a target for lining up that sort of that variable matching. Once we've done that, it's actually a relatively simple process to then start using renaming of content. So I say these are one or two lines of code to sort of rename a lot of this content effectively in the data processing tools that we use in R or Python or otherwise. And it's essentially just a matrix that we want to be able to reproduce. Ideally, what we would also suggest, and this is kind of reflected on the screen here, is maintaining a matrix which kind of reflects the provenance of where the data came from, its original variable name, for example, and then the target name and label, which is based on the registry that we're pointing towards. The harder one is actually then the harmonization of the codes and categories. So do we use one or two, male, female, married or divorced? Even an example we have from our National Statistical Office, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, there are 182 versions of combinations of codes and categories that have been that the ABS had used over time to just represent what the idea of sex in a lot of the collections they have. So you get a lot of variability when you talk about the codes and the categories that you're trying to say something about. These have to be matched. And as I say, just a quick illustration of the sorts of challenge you get in matching. One is that you can get rather large size matrices that can result from these mappings. If you have 10 or 15 combinations of categories that you might be using, you've got 100 cells in a table that you're having to deal with. If you're doing things like occupation, it can be thousands of matrices, and they're relatively sparse matrices, so it can be rather difficult to map them easily. So right now, that's still again another human oriented process. What we're trying to do is make it easier to access and combine those matrices in streamlined ways. The other mapping that what they also do is highlight differences in the use of codes and categories and data management standards between data sets. And I've got a couple of examples of how that can occur in just a moment. So the sorts of things you tend to see, and this is 3 waves of the same question that was asked in the same survey do you trust, can people be trusted? So say you might get, and there's sort of illustrations here that the pointer here on between 1 and 1, sometimes you ask from low to high, no trust and just about always. So you might have to reverse the direction of the scale that you're using. In other cases, you might have the same basic conceptual idea. Sometimes we trust them some of the time, or some of the time they can be trusted, was the 3 terminologies that we use. Essentially, conceptually, they're the same thing, but from the point of view of machine processing, and even with the experience we've done with machine learning, they don't readily pick up the consistencies between those categories. And then, using the same, again, sort of another example down here on the right-hand side, the code for, not at all, and never essentially are saying the same thing, but it really relies quite heavily on human input at the moment to basically say these are the same thing. Once you've done that, it's relatively easy to actually generate an alignment matrix for this. But it does, what we're trying to do is facilitate the human, the human input to say, well, which of these are the same and which of these are different, and hopefully we might be able to feed that in the future into some more machine learning oriented models. The other one that comes out is sentinel and missing values. So what we mean by that is, how do you acknowledge things that are that are no answers or have been skipped or may not be applicable? That can vary quite a lot, and the codes that get used for those can vary quite significantly. And depending upon the question that you're asking, it might be important to know that missing information. But this is just an illustration from another variable from the OSA survey, which reflects the sort of variations you see in missing information. So it's another one we have to try and align. So what we're moving towards progressively is to say, well, here's a set of recommended practices for both missing or sentinel information and the way of encoding and actually pre-processing information to streamline some of this. The last type, and then I'll be coming up to where to next, is data type harmonization. And I mentioned this was things like encoding of characters at the data level and at the in your ASCII representations of information. It probably and this is where we want to include much more standardized practice as well. Things like accurately representing missing values. What do you do with blank missing values? Different software will deal with missing information and represent that missing information in quite different ways, which make it hard to move between systems. So enabling the encoding of that information. Recommended data types is also one that we can kind of standardize as well by referring out to standardized lists of data types and so forth. So overall, what we've gone through and produced in the report itself is a core workflow and set of recommended practices for trying to harmonize social survey data with greater consistency. In first case between ADA and SICT, but hopefully also with our broader colleague of data archiving community, and hopefully into the broader community as well. We're working on a set of tools, in fact, for standardizing those processes between that we can present to data producers for them to be able to reuse as well. The next steps we're looking at to be able to test the workflow on our forthcoming social surveys coming up this year and early next year, to be able to implement common workflows and processing rules between ADA and SICT. That includes for things like the variables, codes, and labels, using hopefully the content registries, for example, that SICT have for the European Social Survey, and to try and target standards and registries to be machine interoperable, so that we can draw down that standardized information, standardized representations from existing tools and services that are, that say, well, this is what you should do, and that we can hopefully streamline some of the automation through those standardized registries as well. So I'll leave it there. I think we're going to come back to questions a little bit later on.
Thanks very much, Steve. Thank you. So, lovely audience, remember to put any questions in the chat for our Q&A section at the very end. And Beth, on to you.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thanks for that, Steve. It's always really neat to see what the other work packages are working on. We are in the fortunate position in the cultural heritage case study that a lot of the work of aligning the variables that are used in different metadata standards has already been done by the community. And so we have a very different approach. We have less technical challenges, I suspect, than the social sciences surveys do, but we'll get into that. Hi, my name is Beth Kazook, and I'm the project manager for research data at the Digital Repository of Ireland. I'm going to talk about work package 13, Cultural Heritage Case Study, where our deliverable, our second deliverable for this case study, was published at the end of May, and it contains recommendations for sharing image data. So first, just a couple quick notes about us and why the Digital Repository of Ireland is involved in this work package. We are Ireland's national repository for the arts, humanities, and social sciences data. We have, actually this slide is a little bit out of date now, I think we have about 58 member institutions that come from across the island, contributing data from a variety of different collecting frameworks. So we do have some research data from the arts, humanities, and social sciences, as I mentioned, that are created by researchers working often in academic institutions. But we also have a wide variety of cultural heritage records. So we have stuff from libraries, higher education institutions, and we also have local archives, community archives, etc. We've got a wide variety of things to work with. So we're kind of a microcosm already of different types of interactions of different types of data. And so it was really interesting to see how we could take this and align the support that we already offer with the FAIR principles perhaps better than we were already aiming to align with them. So very quickly, the goals for Work Package 13 were to identify and document existing image sharing practices. So we produced a mapping report, as Alex said in the introduction, where we looked at professional practice across the GLAM sector, so galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. We also created something called a FAIR implementation profile for cultural heritage, which was really actually our first version of that FIP was focused on DRI's practices. So what is it that we support? What are the different technical ways that we provide information about the collections that we have in our repository? And we also aim to bring together a diverse group of professionals into a working group to discuss challenges and opportunities with FAIR. We didn't want the recommendations and the information in this report to be processed only by ourselves. We wanted to have kind of as I guess to follow along with the theme of WorldFAIR, we wanted to have more global input on what was valuable for cultural heritage and what was actually possible for cultural heritage, and where perhaps the FAIR principles could be more sensitive to practices that are already well established within the sector. So I'm not talking about that report today in too much detail. I'm going to kind of skip ahead over some of the things that we found because that was in our previous webinar. So if you want to take a look at the webinar series, you can go and find me talking about that first report on the WorldFAIR project website. We're going to talk more about what came of all of that work. I'm kind of analyzing the landscape and working with our working group to find out what the kind of responses were to the findings from that report. And then we published a set of recommendations to improve FAIR practices. Now it says there in the goal that we were aiming to improve FAIR practices at DRI, because our recommendations report is aimed actually more broadly at the cultural heritage sector. So they recommend what we should do, but not necessarily exactly how to do it. Because there are a lot of cultural heritage institutions that may have different levels of capability and could implement these things in different ways. But we also wanted to provide a case study of how it could be implemented. So we're trying out what these recommendations mean for the digital repository environment. What improvements can we make to our repository services that are in response to the recommendations that came of the working group? So we're at the phase right now where we are testing the recommendations at DRI. We have an implementation plan and we are just beginning to work through the first bits. We are aiming to produce a report at the end of the project that will share our results, that are going to offer some feedback. We probably won't get through absolutely everything by the end of the WorldFAIR project, but we'll have a roadmap for where we are going to be, where we want to be. So just a brief recap of our cultural heritage image sharing working group. Move this out of my way for a second. I did share in our previous webinar a little bit of the process that went into developing the recommendations. And the mind map that I'm showing here, I do apologize, it's probably not very readable on the screen. It's in that report. So if you go and you look up D13.1 professional practices, you'll be able to download a actually visible version of this mind map. So you can see kind of what the working group was working with when we produced the recommendations. And these are the recommendations that we actually came up with. So we started out with 5 areas that we kind of condensed all of our findings into, where we found out that there were issues with mutability or the changeability of records, or at least there's something that needed to be acknowledged about how variable and responsive cultural heritage records can be. We also acknowledged that there were issues around transparency, and that there's a lot of information that is sort of retained by professionals in the cultural heritage sector that is not necessarily shared with people, certainly not with researchers on the back end, unless you happen to know to go to an archivist and ask them about, the processing of a particular collection. So we wanted to expose more about that. We also wanted to expose more about the preservation process itself, because there are sort of hidden things that have to do with which file you're actually viewing when you are viewing an image of a cultural heritage object. It's usually not the preservation file, it's sometimes an access derivative. When things begin as digital objects in the first place and you're making access derivatives, it's important to be able to kind of communicate that there may be different files that are available. And that's not always the case. We had issues around, or we identified issues around technology and obviously the application of rights, which can be a little bit fuzzier in the cultural heritage sector than it is necessarily in the research data sector, although there's complications there too, I am aware. But on often cases, what we're sharing as cultural heritage professionals is not stuff that we own, or that we don't necessarily have clear paperwork which asserts that we do in fact own the rights to be able to share this information. I know that there's been a lot of changes in the sector in recent years to ensure that that paperwork going forward is available, because we're more aware of what we might do with collections online. But there's a whole lot of older collections which those permissions are a little bit fuzzy, a little bit unclear, and it's hard to pass that along to the researcher if you're not sure what your rights are in using those images in the first place. And then there's certainly costs. There's costs around digitization and making materials accessible, and having money to have people actually do the work of providing metadata about those materials as well. So those conversations spun out into a set of achievable, what we were going for was recommendations that we thought could actually be implemented across the sector broadly. And they may be implemented in different ways for different institutions. So I will, again, be talking about how DRI is kind of envisioning implementing these for ourselves. But here are the kind of broad categories of things that we decided were doable things. So the first is to recognize that the citation models that exist for bibliographic resources are not necessarily appropriate for image resources, that they could use a little bit of modification. So we recommended a formal citation model for cultural heritage images should be adopted, which recognizes digital surrogates as research objects in and of themselves. And that those references or those citations would include references to revisions of either image data or metadata. So we're kind of exposing the mutability of the metadata record, the fact that it is prone to change and respond to cultural needs over time, and also that the digital image that is provided may change over time. There's kind of a conception within the cultural heritage sector that digital images are surrogates. We tend to think of them as kind of more metadata, but those digital images are being used as data. They become the research objects in and of themselves, and we have no really good way to cite that, to indicate that the digital object created at this point in time by this particular type of software, by this institution, is actually what was being used in this data set. And this is what was being referenced by this researcher. A lot of times we sort of look through the images to the original objects that are being depicted, and we only record metadata about those original objects. Recommendation 2 was to improve transparency. So information about the creation, management, and preservation of files should be visible and understandable by both humans and machines. So what we wanted to do is basically take a lot of administrative data and push that forward. Say, actually, we should be exposing this. We should perhaps take the embedded metadata in digital objects and make that visible and available for others to reference. Data documentation was recommendation number 3. The process of selection, scope, and completeness of the data should always be documented. This is something that, again, often gets discussed and retained as administrative metadata. It's information that is behind the scenes that we don't necessarily share with our users. For instance, you might not digitize the whole of a collection. There may be more objects that are available, but when you're looking at the collection online, you have a sense that this is complete, that actually I'm seeing everything that is available from this particular collection. So we wanted to kind of expose more information about what is online and why, and where you can find more information. Recommendation 4, licensing and rights. We just need to align ourselves around some standard means of expressing rights and licenses and labels. And labels should be applied consistently and in a standardized way. So within the cultural heritage sector, there's often a rights statement. They're actually very good at explaining ownership of materials or declaring things as being in the public domain, but it's kind of free text information. It's usually not something that we would often see in the data world as a standardized license. There is something that I'm going to talk about in a second that has been developed for the cultural heritage sector called rights statements, which are meant to standardize rights. But for the most part, what you see expressed in an image record at a cultural heritage institution is just free text. It's just information. And sometimes it's not even really very clear information. A lot of times it puts the onus onto the researcher to determine if they have the rights for the use that they want to use those images for. And that's something that, in order for that data or the information in a cultural heritage record to be really usable, it needs to be clearer what permissions are being granted by the institution. And so, for instance, the metadata within the record itself could be openly licensed so that that can be reused even if the image can't. Recommendation number 5 comes around delivery. And it was just this idea that improved support for identifier schemes, APIs, and machine-readable contextual data was something that the sector needs to work harder towards. There is the use of permanent links in a lot of cases, but there's a lot of image collections that are in unstable and unreliable links. There are identifier schemes usually employed within archives or within museums that give unique object IDs, but then that doesn't always translate to the online world, and that those IDs are not always unique when expressed online, especially if they're using similar systems. So we wanted to kind of basically recommend PIDs here, but also recognizing that the way we expose information about our collections as well needs to be more machine interoperable. So we're looking at providing downloadable metadata as well as metadata that you can view on a screen. And that's not always the case, again, in a lot of cultural heritage repositories or image sharing platforms. So how is the DRI approaching a number of these recommendations? Well, we have kind of a balance in a lot of cases of both technical and social strategies. Some of these are not technically very difficult to implement, especially since DRI has been using things like persistent identifiers already. So we kind of, we wrote a recommendation and we already ticked the box on that particular recommendation. So we're looking for different ways that we can explore enhancing that. So we're looking at our own API, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. Recommendation number 1, the citation model, we're looking at what we can do to improve the ability of the researcher to correctly cite the version of the digital record that they are using, especially if that digital record might be updated over time. There may be a new digital asset. If a museum gets a better camera and decides to go back over their collections, which you think would be a great thing, that here's a much better version of this image than I was able to provide before, and yet you change the data. This is now no longer the same image that was previously used in a research project. So that you need to be able to identify when those changes do happen and be consistent about what we are presenting within our citation model. So I have an example here taken from DRI's current citation model, where the date that is expressed there is always the publication date in the repository. But what we want to do is split out the date of creation and the date of publication so that it's just very clear. For instance, this TikTok video was not created in 2023, it was created in 2021. We want to be able to retain information about the object that is correct for the object itself, but then also correct for the publication and the version of the image that you are seeing. We also want to add information about the type, the file type that you're actually downloading. And sometimes in cultural heritage institutions, you have options. You might download a TIFF. They might also make a JPEG accessible. It'd be really nice to know which one it was that you downloaded and to see that within the citation. Social strategies is we're not doing the citation work alone. We're aware that there are others in the field who are interested in providing more detailed information about cultural heritage objects so that they are reusable in data contexts. And so there's a group out of Padua that has an IOSC Future grant that was looking at a FAIR enabling citation model for cultural heritage objects, and we've had a few conversations with them. Then around transparency, our technical strategy is we are going to try and expose more of the information that we get embedded into digital files themselves. That's metadata that we're not requiring our members to add into the record because it's already available. There's a lot of stuff that goes into image files that is added by the machines that created the images. So the camera will add date information, for instance, and sometimes location information. The scanner will embed information about the scanner software that created the image. And again, probably the date of creation of the image. We want to pull that information out and just expose it. So the way we're going about doing that first, though, is to survey our members and ask them what type of metadata we're receiving from them, what their practices are around digitization, and on embedding or stripping metadata out of the files that they contribute to our repository. Because we're not the creators of the files in a lot of cases, we're curious to know what the variety is that we would get if we began to expose this information. And are there any concerns around sensitivity or privacy in exposing something like location data from photos? Or is there sometimes embedded metadata that shouldn't be shared? It should be stripped out of the image. We're also going to be having a conference upcoming, save the date if you are interested at all in discussing digital preservation in the arts, social sciences, and humanities on July 27th to 28th. We're going to be talking a lot about the work that we're doing in the WorldFAIR project and hopefully showcasing some of the outcomes of this work at that conference. So DPASH is a conference that the DRI hosts every 2 years. And it just happens to coincide with the end of the WorldFAIR project for us this year. Data documentation. We're looking at an emerging trend towards data sheets for data sets. And there's actually a recent publication that's come out in the Journal of Open Humanities, I believe, that's data sheets for digital cultural heritage objects specifically. So we're talking with some of the authors of that particular publication to see if perhaps rather than reinventing the wheel and coming up with our own data sheets, we would use that particular recommendation for data sheets. And what that looks at tackling is, again, some of the hidden administrative information that we don't always think to write down about how collections came into being. How did they come into the museum? Was there a selection process that saw some collections objects that were donated not be accepted into the museum? Is there other places that we can find things? Or is this related to other collections? What's online? Is it everything that's in the collection, or is it just a sampling of what's in the collection? It's just asking a bunch of broad questions about where the stuff came from and how much of it we're really seeing. One of the social strategies that kind of complements this is we did a birds of a feather session at the recent Research Data Alliance / IDW plenary conference in Salzburg, almost a little bit more than a month ago now, I think, where we suggested that there is a need in the professional community for a collections as data interest group to continue to discuss these issues. So these data sheets for digital cultural heritage are also being discussed and trialed with some of the other members of that newly formed group, which gives us more of a group of people with which to kind of bounce ideas off of and refine our own implementation of the data sheets. Finally, in implementing licensing and rights, I gave kind of an indication earlier that we are looking at employing not just Creative Commons licenses, which are widely used across the data sector, but rights statements. So something that formalizes those fuzzier statements and fuzzier language around who owns the material in the first place and why is it in a collection and it's being shared, but what are the potential limitations or advice that a researcher would need in order to make a decision about using the material. And you can see here I've grabbed a couple of examples of things that are a little bit more nuanced than perhaps what you would get with a Creative Commons license. You can label something an orphan work, and then that implies that you can do certain things within the orphan work framework. Contractual restrictions might indicate that, well, you can use this, but there are reasons why it can't be used in certain circumstances or certain situations that can then be clarified maybe in free text. But it groups things a little bit more easily so that machines can understand what the rights are that are associated with objects as well as the licenses. This is going to take probably a lot more work to socialize than it will actually to implement, because these are just labels that we're going to give depositors options to tack onto their records. The social strategies are to actually train people how to use these statements. And we're aiming to start with a plain English page on copyright and right statements that will go up on the DRI website. Finally, recommendation number 5. We're going to do some fun stuff with our existing linked data offerings. We haven't quite got this nailed down yet, but we are in conversation to have a university class of students basically try to do fun things with the DRI repository and let us know what they can and cannot do in terms of accessing, visualizing, and reusing materials that are in our repository. We also have a blog series that we started with some of our working group members from that working group that helped produce the recommendations in the first place, where we're inviting them to share what the recommendations mean for them in their institutional or cultural contexts and kind of how they might be implemented differently in different places. Because as I mentioned, this is just kind of a case study of how DRI would interpret these recommendations based on what we were already offering and what we're technologically capable of offering in the near future as well. So I realize that brings us pretty well to the end of the webinar time. Sorry about that, Alex. But that is it for me.
Thanks very much, Beth. Thank you. We do have a few questions for you, Beth, in the chat from Ari. The first question is, does DRI use the FRBR model for versioning and relationships between the object and its digital representation? Because there is an RDA output from Jens Klump on this.
Oh, and it's actually a fairly recent output too. I kind of thought Ferber was falling by the wayside. It wasn't as, like, it came out a good 10, 15 years ago now, and it has not been widely implemented as far as I'm aware. Although maybe I need to take another look at that. But yeah, Ferber does show relationships between kind of original concepts. So something like the idea of one of Jane Austen's novels, Pride and Prejudice. And then it shows manifestations and expressions of it. So it could be a movie about Pride and Prejudice, and it could be a book, the book itself, Pride and Prejudice, but it's all sort of able to link different versions of things together. I know within the cultural heritage world, or more specifically within the museum world, the Getty has a vocabulary, CONA, Cultural Object Name Authority, which sort of attempts to do the same thing, but it's not as complex as Ferber. It doesn't show manifestations and iterations. It basically is a controlled vocabulary that allows you to say, this is the Mona Lisa and this is a derivative of the Mona Lisa. So these are all linked to representations of the same concept. But I may have to look at that again. Certainly if there's an RDA output.
Yeah, it just came to my mind. I didn't know how much it was used, and thanks for that one, because I was thinking that really specifying, because in that model the item is the lowest or kind of the least specific part of it. But of course, in the case when you're talking about a physical object and then taking it's an interesting subject, at least from looking at outside. Thanks for commenting that.
Yeah, and I know it was envisioned as a way of bringing different things together within the library catalog as well. So if you have lots of different versions over the years, editions of, let's say, Pride and Prejudice, then you can link them all across different libraries and institutions to demonstrate that if somebody's searching for this, they're really searching for the same thing. Again, I feel like it's recently been replaced, but I'd have to do more research to look at that.
Okay, that's good. Thanks.
Thanks, Sari. Thanks, Beth. There is another question from Ari, but I'm thinking that it's probably being answered by Joan. So do you have examples of the right statements? And Joan provided a link. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think Joan's link is doing the job. That is the right statements, and you can see all the different versions on the page.
Great. Do we have any more questions from our attendees to Steve or Beth? And you can also raise your hand or just unmute and ask. No, so I know we're running a bit over time, but I will ask one last question, if I may, to both of our presenters today. So in the WorldFAIR project, we talk about the work being cross-disciplinary and applicable across domains. So would you be able to give us a few examples, both of you or either of you, on cross-disciplinary application of the work that you're doing, whether this is between other work packages and case studies in WorldFAIR and yourselves or outside of the project?
I can maybe go first on that. At the RDA plenary, our conversation around collections of data, I originally pitched an interest group for RDA that was cultural heritage data. I thought there needed to be a conversation around that, and it could be a bit, it could be a bit focused, be a place for people who want to talk about cultural heritage specifically. And then I wound up inviting someone who was working on a biodiversity museum collection, a repository that supports biodiversity museums. And the point was made that collections as data is bigger than cultural heritage. It's one piece of the pie, but there's lots of different collecting frameworks that could be informed by the recommendations that we're doing, because the way that things are handled in museums, it's not always cultural heritage information that's being handled. It's not always records that I specifically would think of within that framework. So our interest group has shifted to talk about collections as data, which is bigger than just cultural heritage data. But obviously cultural heritage data can feed into and inform what we do there.
Thanks. So, Steve, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the workflows that we've been looking at, they have their foundations in the social sciences. I think essentially we have two related work packages in WorldFAIR, the population health and the urban health program, which are both looking at data integration practices in those domains. And I think we've essentially come up with a workflow that actually could be readily applicable in those domains as well. That's not a conversation we've had yet, but looking at some of the more recent outputs from those teams, I think is one that we might want to look at for the cross-domain framework. The second point there is in a sense that the sort of harmonization that we're doing, anywhere where anyone's got essentially tabular data that's going to be requiring essentially matching columns and matching conceptually how do we measure the same thing. The specifics will be different, but I think probably the tools and practices are going to be relatively similar. So I think there's probably extensions there into related domains. Certainly some of the work that we picked up and we've tried some initial implementations, essentially using, for example, standardized R libraries. That it's not social science specific content. Sometimes we encode some of the conceptual domain-specific knowledge in different ways, but essentially the software applications and the software development there, and essentially the data management, I don't think varies all that much, to be frank. So looking at how those applications might exist and the procedures might exist across domains, I think is probably an area for future development as well.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you. And thanks both. So I think we can conclude unless we have any comments from the audience. No? Okay, well, we're 5 minutes past the hour. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Steve. Thanks, Beth, for your presentations. And thanks to our attendees for being here. So as we mentioned, we are scheduling new dates for 2024. So make sure to check the WorldFAIR website. And thanks again.